Good afternoon. Members will recall that Leo MacArthur had submitted a question, wasn't here to answer it. Can I just say to the Chamber that Mr MacArthur has provided a very full apology and explanation. The first item of business is a debate on motion number S4M-06582 in the name of Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's proposals for electricity market reform are at an important stage in their development. I therefore welcome this opportunity to bring these issues back to Parliament. We have debated these reforms twice before, back in January 2011 when they were first introduced, and again in September 2012, with a consensus amongst members that EMR must build on Scotland's strengths and support for us continuing to work closely with the UK Government, for which we were grateful. Since then, in November last year, the UK Energy Bill has been introduced in the UK Parliament. The fundamental changes which this bill will deliver make it vital that the Scottish Parliament be given an opportunity to debate these latest information and proposals. The Scottish Ministers share the high-level ambitions of the UK Government to move to a low-carbon electricity generating mix, to maintain security of energy supply and support the interests of consumers. Can I say that, therefore, I propose to say that I accept the amendment from the Conservatives. I have some sympathy with much of the amendment from the Labour Party, but we do not feel that it sufficiently explains some of the propositions contained therein. I just say that out of courtesy to members at the outset, Presiding Officer. But I do hope that there will be more agreement in this debate than discord. Now, we share the reality that the scale of generation and transmission investment needed is very significant indeed, and the EMR proposals aim to deliver large-scale investment in low-carbon generation whilst ensuring security of supply in a cost-effective way. We have said from the outset that if this is done correctly, the reforms can provide the necessary regulatory and price certainty for low-carbon technologies. I am also saying today that we need to provide certainty for low-carbon technologies, and we need to do that quickly. Thus far, unfortunately, the reform has been too slow and the proposals have been too complex. And I will come on to some examples later, but let me first set out where we want to be. At the core of its reforms, the bill introduces contracts for difference. These replace the renewables obligation, or ROCs, and the purpose is to support investment in low-carbon generation. This will provide long-term price certainty by stabilising returns for generators at a fixed level and thereby incentivising the necessary investment. The renewables obligation, ROCs, has worked very well for Scotland. After a record year for deployment in 2012, we now have 5.8 gigawatts of renewable capacity in Scotland, almost 40%, Presiding Officer, of the UK total. Our introduction of higher support levels for wave and tidal generation in 2007 has helped attract investment and establish Scotland as a marine renewables hub. And indeed, there has been in 2012 over £1,000 million invested in renewable schemes in Scotland, a substantial figure by any yardstick. 6 years later, after 2007, the UK Government followed our lead and they introduced higher support for wave and tidal generation in England and Wales. So we believe it is that track record of attracting investment and maintaining investor confidence that our agreement to support the UK's transition to contracts for difference will achieve. The levels of support available under contracts for difference, called the strike price, will be published by the UK Government for consultation in July, and we welcome that. We have a key role in this process and are already working with the UK on both the analytical and decision-making aspects. And I understand that over the coming weeks we will get more detail on the levels of support which are likely to be offered, and this may give us enough of the confidence that we need, but we are not there yet. The ongoing uncertainty about EMR is the challenge we face. Industry leaders have made it clear that to make investment decisions, they need clarity and certainty on support from government, and they need it urgently. But at present, and indeed for the last couple of years since EMR was announced, we have seen an interruption in what should have been a steady flow in investment in generating capacity. Back in June last year, Presiding Officer, Keith Anderson of Scottish Power said this: "The questions I will get asked is, how does the mechanism work? The answer right now, I don't know. What is the strike price? I don't know. Do I know when the mechanism will be in place? I'm not too sure." Keith Anderson. And despite introduction of the bill in November, we still don't know the answers to these fundamental questions. Not only with strike prices for renewables, the Energy Bill introduces proposals for a capacity market, which are crucial to the future investment decisions in gas plant in Scotland and the UK. But again, Presiding Officer, there is no detail. The UK Government recognises that we need significant investment in new gas plant. Back in December, Ed Davey said that up to 26 gigawatts of new gas plant would be required by 2030. But here we are in a situation where we have projects with planning consent, but where investment decisions cannot be taken because there's no rules for that investment decision to be taken. Ignacio Galan, Iberdrola's chairman, said on 14th of February, "If the decision is not taken in a hurry, the decisions of investment will be delayed. And if the decisions of investments are delayed, the country can suffer blackouts during the decade. That is particularly shocking. We require numbers." Now, on carbon capture and storage, we believe there should be more focus and perhaps less focus on nuclear. And I would refer to the negotiations with EDF and the project in Somerset. We only have to look, Presiding Officer, at the media to see what a guddle they are in. Only this week, Sam Laidlaw of Centrica, who in February, and for very good reason, pulled out of the partnership to build Hinkley Point C, said, "Not only had the cost increased, but also the schedule had lengthened very considerably. So instead of taking 4 to 5 years to build, EDF were telling us that it was going to take 9 to 10 years to build. That is a long time to be writing out a cheque for this project." Meanwhile, we have 2 carbon capture and storage projects proposed in Scotland, subject to their obtaining the appropriate permissions, offering us the real opportunity to reduce the impact of coal and gas generation on our carbon emissions. I am pleased the Peterhead project has made it onto the preferred bidders list of the UK CCS commercialisation competition. I indicated that when I met Michael Fallon a couple of weeks ago, and I am pleased it will go forward to the next stage. But beyond that, we have got no clarity or framework for how CCS projects will be incentivised. I chaired the Thermal Generation and Carbon Capture and Storage Industry Leadership Group meeting earlier this week, and this is what the industry experts are telling me. They are telling me this: the UK Government must outline a clear investment signal for coal and CCS as part of the future energy mix, but this cannot be done in isolation from other generation technologies. The UK Government must look at modelling work across the whole energy sector to determine the mix required. If left to the markets to decide, we may find ourselves in a situation where by the time it takes to reach these decisions, it is simply too late to do anything about it. But most importantly, investors need to know the price they are going to get for that CCS coal-fired generation, and this must be the clearest signal. If we don't have this clarity and urgency of purpose, we risk losing the infrastructure that is necessary to keep the UK coal industry alive, and we will lose it forever. We also need to ensure that we retain the sites of existing coal-fired power stations, which are least likely to give any rise to local objections to their use. And here is the potential prize. Projects like the Captain Clean Energy Project, CCEP, which is currently on the DEC's CCS competition reserve list, has potential benefits of up to 8,000 jobs during the construction phase, with potential GVA of £3,400 million. And during the operational phase, I will in a minute, and during the operational phase, jobs created could total 3,000, with annual GVA of up to £130 million a year. Huge benefits, Presiding Officer.
Liam McArthur.
Very grateful to the Minister for taking intervention. I hear what he says about uncertainty and the implications of that, and some of those concerns I would certainly share. Could he perhaps advise the Chamber in relation to the coal price that he wishes to see set? Are there any representations the Scottish Government has made in that regard, and if so, what the detail of those representations are?
Minister.
Well, I'm not sure if he means with the coal price, which is really determined by market forces, but perhaps the strike price in respect of contract for difference, and it's a perfectly fair question. We are working very closely with DEC officials, and my officials are meeting them next week, and we will look very carefully at the level of support required. I mean, plainly, we want the right level of support, which is neither too high to overly reward the developers, but too low to inhibit development. This is not an easy task, but the point I'm making today, Presiding Officer, is that carbon capture and storage has been the Cinderella of the energy world. We must increase its status. I hope that's an argument that will win support in this Parliament today. The prizes, the benefits to the supply chain in Scotland are simply enormous. And in fact, it seems to me, although I'm not an expert in these areas, it is in fact a sine qua non of Europe achieving its emissions targets. Now, these uncertainties, these challenges, Presiding Officer, are exactly why we're working so closely with the UK Government on these reforms and are determined to continue to do so. We've already secured a statutory role for Scottish ministers in key aspects of the reforms, including the design and delivery of the Contracts for Difference framework, and I'm pleased to announce today that the two governments have agreed to develop an intergovernmental concordat to help deliver continuing and enduring joint working between the Scottish and the UK Government. Only by doing so can we ensure that EMR is delivered in a way which is fair, open and transparent, and which ensures that the interests of the Scottish sector are represented, and above all has the confidence of consumers, generators, developers and investors. And it's the sort of intergovernmental cooperation which has led to the publication of the Scottish Islands Renewable Project report yesterday, Presiding Officer, which, as you are aware, was in response to a question from my good friend Mr MacArthur. Led by the First Minister, we have been arguing for a change in the transmission charging regime since 2009, for 4 years now. There is an urgent need to find a solution for unleashing the massive renewables potential of the Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland, which is hindered by an unfair charging regime. Quite simply, how can it be fair for the charge to be, for access to the grid, about £10 per kilowatt hour in the mainland and up to £130 for the Western Isles? That is something that everyone can see, no matter what knowledge they have about the energy world, that is simply unfair and must be tackled in some way. Therefore, I was delighted that Ed Davey took up my suggestion to establish the Intergovernmental Steering Group and commission a report to assess the barriers, and that report published yesterday is a major step forward, and I'm pleased that industry view that as well. The Chief Executive of Aquamarine said, "We have not definitively solved the issue of island grids just yet, but it looks very much like the willingness to tackle the problem head-on has, at very long last, arrived." And that report makes absolutely clear that the islands can make a cost-effective contribution to 220 renewables and decarb targets if issues around grid access and high transmission charging can be addressed. And the islands can supply up to 5% of the total electricity needs in the UK by 2030. Up to 5%, according to that report. But there's much to be done still. On the basis of the report, I'll be proposing to the UK Government an Islands CFD uplift. This is to provide the appropriate investment signals to renewables developers and also to SSE, Scottish Hydroelectric Transmission Limited, as network provider. I'm also urging the UK Government to work with us to develop new approaches to help manage the significant costs of underwriting the first phase of large subsea cable projects. Now, I know that these proposals need to represent good value for money to consumers. The report provides compelling evidence that onshore wind on the islands can make a significant contribution to energy and carbon reduction targets.
Can I ask you to bring your remarks to a close?
Yes, I certainly will. And I also welcome that the report shows island wind can be a cheaper option than offshore wind and is comparable with nuclear power, biomass and imported wind. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am very pleased that in relation to electricity market reform, we are near to the start of the beginning.
Thank you, Minister. I think it would be helpful if I could just give some guidance to members that time is tight in the debate, but we should get everybody in who wishes to speak. provided that everybody keeps very close to their time limit. I call on Rhoda Grant to speak to move amendment S4M-06582.1. Ms Grant, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Energy market reform must be set in a framework that allows the energy market to exist for the next 40 years or so. At its heart must be energy security, and we in the Labour Party believe that we must have a sustainable energy mix that provides energy security but also cuts carbon emissions in order to tackle climate change. And it's therefore disappointing that there's been so little progress since we last debated EMR. There's a number of issues that I raised then that are still outstanding. For example, we need to have policies that cut energy consumption in the energy bill. We also need targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And while we have developed renewable electricity, we have not tackled carbon emissions from heat and transport. We need to tackle emissions from our homes, not only to deal with carbon, but also to deal with fuel poverty. We also talked back then about island transmission charging, and we appear to be no further forward. I welcome, along with the Minister, the Scottish Islands Renewable Project final report, but it only tells us what we already know, but we need urgent solutions. Time is running out, and we face the real risk of losing the ability to procure an interconnector to the Western Isles. The Orkney Islands grid connection is at full capacity, and while we boast of the world-leading research and development facilities for wave and tidal energy in Orkney, our grid connections an embarrassment. The same could be said about Shetland, where we have the potential for the Viking development, which is 50-50 owned by the Islands Trust. But again, this could be put at risk by the lack of grid connections. We also have the uncertainty created by a looming referendum that provides uncertainty to the energy markets as well. It is increased by the lack of information on contracts for a difference and the strike price that developers can expect.
Right, Mackenzie.
Do you agree with me then that the UK Government are greatly contributing to uncertainty at a far greater proportion than any constitutional uncertainty?
The help of members would speak through the chair. Ms Grant.
The point I am making is that both those issues create uncertainty, and we need to deal with them if we're going to reap the benefits that renewable development can provide us with. It also looks uncertain at the moment whether the Scottish Government will have the ability to vary contracts for a difference, taking into account Scottish issues. We've seen the Scottish Government hand powers to set emission levels from power stations back to the UK Government while boasting of their grid decarbonisation targets. This is not progress. Both governments are dragging their feet, passing the buck. And once again, the Scottish people are stuck between two governments with the wrong priorities. We can't have an energy bill that doesn't look at energy consumption and cutting out energy use. Regardless of the investment in new generation technologies, energy will always be a scarce resource, and we need to use it widely. We're still dependent on fossil fuels for heat, and yet little has been done to develop renewable technologies in this area, and we're still waiting for a renewable heat initiative. However, we also need to reduce our use of heat, and to do this we have to give priority to insulating our homes and buildings. There's nothing in the energy bill to encourage better insulation and reduce consumption. And the Scottish Government look to be watering down their own proposals to increase energy efficiency for new building regulations. And the insulation industry was reported recently saying that these proposals and delays will cost jobs and investment. And while we know there's tensions between builders and energy efficient standards, we need to look at how we bring this forward. It's a false economy to do otherwise. Poorly insulated homes will need to be retrofitted in the future and do nothing whatsoever to fight fuel poverty. If we're really interested in fighting fuel poverty, we need to ensure that people have warm homes as a basic human right. There also needs to be a step change on how we retrofit existing house stock and how this is paid for, because those who can afford are investing in this already, but those living in fuel poverty can't. And there are also real concerns about how the Green Deal will work for people in those areas as well. Fuel poverty is a huge issue in our island communities, and welcoming the Scottish Islands Renewable Project final report, highlighting the extent of this problem, but we need to find the solutions now. If we don't resolve the issue about the costs of the connector to the Western Isles in the next few weeks, I understand from SSE that they may lose their procurement contract for cable. And if that happens, it's difficult to see when indeed an interconnector could be built. Prices are already increasing. Inflation is huge on cable, meaning that more delays mean more costs, making the whole thing uneconomical. The islands are one of the areas where fuel poverty is at its worst, but there is also community land ownership, which provides the opportunity for communities to generate power, which they can use locally to address fuel poverty. The ability to deal differently with generation and sale is possible, but we need the connections that allow this to happen. There's also nothing in the energy bill to encourage community development. If communities have control and influence over their energy generation, they will ensure that local economies benefit. Electricity market reform needs to recognise these benefits. Community benefit clauses are okay at a level. However, allowing communities to have ownership is the real prize. There are large developers who, rather than pay community benefit, give shares in the development working alongside communities, and this is a real step forward. However, allowing the communities to develop their own renewables must be a priority. We have a real opportunity to change the dynamics of how we produce and sell electricity, an opportunity to create a real market rather than one dominated by the big six. But again, this appears to be an opportunity lost. Turning again to the referendum, the Minister himself pointed out that the energy market needs certainty, but unfortunately the referendum creates huge instability. The Scottish Government refuses to answer the simple question of how they will fund renewable developments and meet their existing obligations in this respect. And if I can just make the point, and maybe I'll get the answer. We have a third of the UK's renewables, but only a tenth of the customer base that pays for it. Will the Scottish Government continue to pay ROCs or indeed contracts for a difference and the like under an independent Scotland?
Minister.
Can I just ask the member, she said that the referendum is creating uncertainty amongst investors. Can she name any single renewable energy scheme which has been cancelled or delayed as a result of that matter?
Rhoda Grant.
We are seeing delays, and indeed developers are coming to me and highlighting their concerns. The Government has to answer this question because while they argue that there will be a UK energy market, they don't say how subsidies are going to be paid for. If they don't answer that question, it will create huge uncertainty, and the Government at the moment can hide behind contracts for a difference and the delays that's causing. But once that's sorted, they will have nowhere else to hide. I don't see an instance where a country will subsidise another country's renewable developments, and this doesn't happen at the moment when countries share the grid. And indeed, independence is being heralded as nirvana, but it's unlikely that the rest of the UK will subsidise Scotland's renewables any more than it's likely to subsidise French nuclear power developments. I need to make progress. I'm beginning to run out of time, and there are a number of points to make. Turning quickly to the very puzzling development where we have a Scottish Government that is always demanding more powers for Scotland, handing back powers to the UK Government. They're empowering the UK Government to set emissions levels for power generators in Scotland. The levels set by the UK Government do nothing to encourage the use of CCS. In fact, the very opposite. Neither has the UK Government set grid decarbonisation targets for 2030. The Scottish Government has, an announcement that was made with a great deal of hype. However, they're handing away the powers to deliver this. The Scottish Government couldn't say in committee if they would repatriate this power if it was required to meet Scottish targets. Neither would they say what tools they would use if the UK Government do not set emission-level targets.
Member needs to bring the remarks to a close.
To meet their targets. This is puzzling, but it is possibly that this Government has now seen that we are better together. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, it is sad that there is little progress since we last debated EMR. We agree that the Scottish and UK Governments need to work together to secure energy supply and also cut greenhouse gases. However, we are still to be persuaded that the policies on offer will do that, and I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to and move amendment number S4M-06582. Mr Fraser, you have 7 minutes. Mr Fraser will be followed by Dennis Robertson, who is the first speaker in open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by acknowledging the generally positive and consensual manner in which the Minister has approached this subject. This is the latest in a number of debates we have had on EMR, and there has been broad support across the Chamber, both for the principles of EMR and for the constructive engagement of the Scottish Government in that process. It is indeed a pleasure to see Scotland's two governments, one in Westminster and one here in Edinburgh, working so closely together on this particular issue. I hope this is a pattern we will see increasingly adopted across a whole range of other subjects in the coming months. I'd be delighted to hear about more constructive engagement.
I'm just wondering if we can expect that the close relationship between the Scottish Government and Ed Davey and DEC will be matched between the close relationship between Ed Davey and DEC and his colleagues in the Treasury.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I'm not a spokesman for Mr Davey or DEC, or indeed for that matter in the Treasury. There is always a level of lively and constructive debate within the coalition government, as Mr Ewing is well aware, on aspects of these issues, as there is indeed in this chamber. I was a little bit disappointed with the tone of Rhoda Grant's amendment and some of her contribution. I had a very constructive engagement with her Labour colleague Tom Greatrix, as the Shadow Energy Minister, when we both addressed the SCDI just a few weeks ago, and he was much more positive about energy market reform than what we've heard this afternoon. So the Scottish Conservatives are pleased to support the Government motion today. My own amendment relates to another aspect of the work being carried out by Ofgem in connection with the impact of complex tariff structures on consumers. Now, I think we are all aware of situations where constituents have been confused by the wide range of tariffs on offer and have therefore found it impossible to draw accurate comparisons between different providers. Indeed, there is more than a little suspicion that this complexity is created deliberately by energy providers in order to confuse customers and prevent them switching away to another company. What Ofgem's proposals will do is ban complex multi-tier tariffs and limit suppliers to offering 4 tariffs per fuel types. Dead tariffs not available to new customers will be abolished, and all suppliers will be obliged to provide all of their customers with personalised information on the cheapest tariff they offer and help customers with comparison of tariffs. Now, I believe, Presiding Officer, this is a very welcome package of proposals to provide greater clarity in the electricity market. If consumers are better informed and better able to make comparisons between providers, they can switch products more easily, and this will help drive down bills. Now, of course, whether this goes far enough is a moot point, but it is important that this first step be taken and we then monitor closely its impact before we decide whether further measures are necessary. Turning to EMR more generally, there is no doubt this is a complex subject, with contract for difference, strike prices, counterparties, investment instruments and emissions performance standards. A high level of expertise is required to fully understand exactly what is being proposed. And it is important that we get this right. A secure source of affordable energy is required to underpin both consumer demand and economic growth. We do need to increasingly decarbonise our energy supply, but we need to balance that target with the need for security of supply, so we are not reliant, for example, on imported gas, and also, crucially, the issue of affordability, both to business and to the consumer. We need to be incentivising new technologies such as offshore wind, wave and tidal power, and looking to encourage exploitation of unconventional gas. And balancing all of these competing interests is a challenging task, And it's little wonder there have had to be such extensive discussions with so many interested parties in the UK Government in devising its proposals to bring forward. And the engagement of the Scottish Government in this field has been important and has been welcome. And inevitably, this has all taken time. And while some will cry it should be done quicker, I would argue it is essential that, given the importance of the issue, that we take time to get it right. And even the Minister admitted in his speech in relation to the question of strike prices, this was not an easy task. Now, we've heard from the Minister, and we'll hear it this afternoon from those on the SNP benches. Mr Mackenzie already referred to this in his intervention. I'll be disappointed if Mr Mackenzie does not refer to this again in his contribution, which I'm sure is coming, that because it's taken time to finalise these reforms, this is causing investor uncertainty. And to those who make that case, I simply refer to them to the words of our Lord in the Sermon on the Mount: "First cast out the beam out of your own eye, and then you will clearly see to take the speck out of your brother's eye." For any uncertainty caused in relation to EMR is as of nothing compared to the uncertainty caused by the SNP's plans for separation of Scotland from the rest of the UK. And this is a case which has been made by many in the power sector over a period of time. It is also a case very well made in the publication just last week from the David Hume Institute on independence and the market for electricity in Scotland by Professor Peter McGregor and two colleagues from Strathclyde University. It is an excellent and informative academic report, and I would commend it to everyone in the Chamber who wants to understand the potential implications for the electricity market from Scottish independence. Yes, I'll give way.
Minister.
I obviously don't doubt Murdo Fraser's biblical authority, but can he give us any example of any renewable project in Scotland that has been deferred or cancelled because of concerns about the referendum or independence?
I'm just pointing out to the Minister this report, hot off the presses, from esteemed academics at Strathclyde University, who are pointing out precisely the difficulties with the electricity market going forward. For far from the milk and honey picture painted by the SNP, this report concludes, and I quote, "It seems likely that security of supply will prove a greater challenge for Scotland as an independent nation than for Scotland as an integral part of the United Kingdom." And it also concludes there is
the member's in his last 30 seconds.
Final minute. It also includes there is likely to be an increase in the cost of energy in Scotland post-independence, because there is no guarantee, as the report says, that the rest of the UK would purchase Scottish renewable energy when they can develop their own domestic capacity in the form of new nuclear or large-scale biomass, or they can buy cheaper energy from France or Ireland. That is what this report says.
You need to bring your remarks to a close, Mr Fraser.
On the SNP benches, they read it, they'll be better educated as a result. Presiding Officer, on that note, can I just say I am pleased to move the amendment in my name and indicate that, despite our differences, the Scottish Conservatives are very pleased with the work the Scottish Government are doing and their positive engagement with the UK Government on this issue, and we will therefore support the Government motion today.
We now move to open debate. Dennis Robertson, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm, and speeches are 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think for the first 5 minutes of Murdo Fraser's contribution, I was actually agreeing with probably every word. Maybe it was 4.5. But can I say, Presiding Officer, one of the things that Murdo Fraser did say was this is a very complex matter, and indeed it is. When I took part in this debate in September, I then congratulated the Minister for his positive dialogue with the UK Government. And again, I think I've got to congratulate the Minister and indeed our First Minister for the work that they've done, and indeed signing a concordat with Ed Davey. And it's perhaps signing this concordat, Presiding Officer, that I wonder, does Ed Davey know there's a referendum? Because if Ed Davey knows there's a referendum and he's signed into a concordat with the First Minister and this Government, he knows full well that the outcome of that referendum could be that Scotland could be indeed independent, and he's actually looking to secure the future of the energy for the rest of the UK. Yes.
Alex Johnson.
Could it be perhaps that Ed Davey is simply absolutely confident that the Scottish people will give a resounding vote of confidence to the Union?
Dennis Robertson.
I think Ed Davey is probably hedging his bets, Mr Johnson. can also say to Rora Grant, when she's talking about does any country basically receive subsidies from the UK government in terms of the energy, in terms of its production, etc. Yeah, well, actually Ireland does, and so does Norway at the moment, and there's a mechanism there. So, for instance, when we're... yes, indeed.
Rhoda Grant. Rhoda Grant's microphone, please.
Just on that, that was not the point I was making. What I was making was when countries share a grid, they don't cross-subsidise each other's renewable development.
Dennis Robertson.
I think you'll find at the moment that the Ireland and Norway both benefit from the electricity being produced within the UK. And what will happen, basically, I think, since you raised the question of the referendum and the fact that Scotland will, I believe, be an independent country, this is why the concordat is especially, I think, valuable to the UK. We're producing vast amounts of electricity through renewables at the moment. If we look at the principles of the energy bill from the UK, they've got three basic principles. One, to keep the lights on. Two, to have affordable electricity, not just for the industry, but for consumers too. And three, to look at the decarbonisation of production of electricity. Now, three very laudable and commendable principles within their objectives of the bill. And I think, like everyone else, I think we are probably all feeling that maybe progress is somewhat slow in some areas. To keep the lights on, I think we can probably reassure our fellow citizens in the rest of the UK that Scotland will do their bit in trying to ensure that the lights don't go out in England after the referendum. We are on target for producing at least 50% of our electricity by renewables by 2015 and 100% by 2020. Renewables is the future for Scotland. There is no doubt about it. Offshore and onshore wind, tidal and wave. We have the ability, we have the capacity, we have the skills workforce. And in fact, at the moment, we have over 11,000 people working in the renewable industry, with a projection of perhaps at least another 50,000 by 2020 in that industry. Presiding Officer, Scotland is known as the oil and gas capital of Europe. Scotland can also be known as the green energy capital of Europe. There is no doubt in my mind that that is certainly possible, and our aspirations should be that we should be striving to do everything to ensure that that actually does happen. It was the European Commissioner for Energy said that Scotland is the energy powerhouse of Scotland. I agree with him. We certainly are. And we're moving in the right direction, not just to ensure affordable electricity for consumers and industry, but we're actually ensuring jobs for our people and using the skilled workforce that we do have here in Scotland, a skilled workforce that I believe will have the ability and the technology to ensure that we have the electricity and energy for the rest of the century to come. Presiding Officer, I think we need to try and ensure that we've got equity of affordability, and this is where we come to transmission charges. We need to ensure that the islands aren't penalised or discriminated against in terms of their bills and charges to the grid. It's unfair and it's, as I say, discriminatory. I believe the work that the Minister is doing with the UK Government is to be applauded, and perhaps, just perhaps, things could move a little quicker. And perhaps the UK Government, if looking at ensuring that they've got their climate change targets before 2016, would probably help us on a road to an even better future for everyone within these islands. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Presiding Officer, I was very pleased to see the Minister working so constructively with the UK Government, although I was slightly surprised by his rather uncritical motion today, although, to be fair, he did go on to criticise in his speech some of the lack of detail and the time that it was all taking. The Labour amendment is more critical and also broadens out the debate to deal with the issues that many of our constituents are concerned about, and Labour at Westminster has certainly been emphasising these, and that's why it's brought forward proposals in relation to energy bills, fuel poverty, which to a significant extent flows from high energy bills. It is also critical, our amendment, in terms of the lack of measures to reduce demand and its failure to facilitate facilitate the growth of community ownership of renewables, which we think is very important. It could also have added, of course, the failure of the UK Government to set a target for decarbonising the electricity sector by 2030, something which was championed by Ed Miliband a long time ago, and again, to be fair to the Scottish Government, has been supported by them as well. I think it is important to set this within the wider context of UK policies, because this is substantially a reserved area, and two other Labour Party proposals in London are very significant for this agenda. Firstly, the proposal to ensure that energy companies pool the power they generate in order to deal with the opaque and complex way in which energy is sold. And secondly, the proposals from Labour at a UK level to toughen the regulatory regime to ensure that energy companies pass on savings when wholesale prices fail. Now, there is a difficult interface between reserved and devolved areas, and at the end of my speech I'll try and ask some questions about that. But one area that is clearly devolved is the emissions performance standard, but as we all know, through the legislative consent motion, we have handed that over to the UK Parliament, at least for the time being. Now, again, there seems no criticism of that from the Scottish Government, but I know my colleagues in London have been expressing concern at the level at which that is being set by the UK Government, and many people have said that it may well facilitate a dash for gas. And I think it is very important to contrast gas and renewables, because we all know the people who are questioning renewables and saying that at a UK level they are unaffordable. Indeed, some colleagues of Conservative members over there, although to be fair, they don't have this hostility to renewable energy in the Conservative group here in Scotland. But I think 2 points should be made about that. Firstly, the Climate Change Committee at a UK level has said that if we go for the dash for gas and have a gas-dominated market, consumers' bills will be £600 more expensive than if we go for renewables. We should keep repeating that to all those who are sceptical about renewables, and we should also read the report by Cambridge Econometrics, which says that if we go for offshore wind as distinct from gas, there will be 100,000 jobs created across the UK and a growth in GDP of 0.8%. So these are important points, and I hope Conservative colleagues will make them to their colleagues at Westminster. Now, the two pillars of reform are, of course, doing something about energy security through capacity markets, and I won't say anything about that part because I don't really understand it. And secondly, the contracts for difference, which we have heard a lot more about. Again, they are lacking in detail, as the Minister has said, but I think that they are right in principle, although I do note the point that's been made elsewhere, that they are partly designed to help the UK support nuclear without falling foul of state aid rules. But be that as it may, I think the primary function of them is to incentivise investment, particularly, of course, in renewables, but in the rest of the UK to some extent, and also in nuclear. Now, we know that we're told we need £110 billion of investment in this decade, so that is why it is important that we get on with this quickly, that we find out what the strike prices are, and I agree entirely with what the Minister said about carbon capture and storage. Clearly, that is a key area where we need to have that information in order to give investors certainty, but clearly we want it in all the renewable areas as well. Now, again, as in the past, I give credit to the Scottish Government for all that they've done in relation to renewable energy, but I want to end by just trying to understand the situation a bit better, because I've taken an interest in the whole issue of ROCs for renewable, and my general understanding is that ROCs for new investment will end in 2017, but I did notice from the House of Commons research paper, and this albeit written a few months ago, that it said, and I don't think I've got time to quote it all, but it was basically saying that the Scottish Government was expressing some uncertainty about contacts for difference, and I quote here, this is quoting the Scottish Government, is not yet in a position to make a decision on whether and to what extent the renewable obligation in Scotland should be closed to new generation from 2017. So perhaps in his wind-up speech the Minister can deal with that issue, because it's not clear to me whether ROCs may continue after 2017. And given that there is a strong devolved element to ROCs, which I've certainly noted in relation to biomass as well as some other energy sources, will there also be a devolved element to contracts for difference? So those are just areas where I have a certain amount of uncertainty. And the last, I think I've got half a minute left time to mention this from the Electricity Market Reform Policy overview from the UK Government. In its section on devolved nations, it says Scottish ministers have agreed to a statutory consultation role in the transition in 2027 to the operation of a certificate purchase scheme, also known as fixed rock scheme in Scotland. Well, to me that is totally incomprehensible, so if the Minister has time to explain that in his wind-up, I would also be grateful.
Many thanks. Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Presiding Officer, the timing of this debate is fortuitous because it follows hard on the heels of an Ofgem seminar given in Edinburgh earlier this week by the soon-to-retire Chief Executive, Alistair Buchanan. Mr Buchanan gave a remarkably frank presentation, and it was a great pity that I didn't see any of our opposition members there. Had they been there, I think their eyebrows would have risen as high as the rest of the audience, an audience which comprised of a veritable who's who of the energy sector in Scotland. Mr Buchanan gave a very stark warning. Due to the uncertainties of energy market reform, there is a real risk of the lights going out in England. Reserve capacity there has declined to just 4%. Presiding Officer, I raised this concern earlier this week in the Chamber, and the Tory and Lib Dem members in particular seem to find this very funny. And I find this a fairly strange attitude because it's not a prospect that certainly I would wish for any of our friends and neighbours in England. Mr Buchanan outlined how many of the assumptions that had been made about importing energy from France, from Ireland, from Russia and elsewhere were fraught with difficulties, not least because many of our European neighbours are also energy importers on a significant scale, and assumptions of importing energy from these countries may not prove to be at all realistic. And in the question session afterwards, from what was a very knowledgeable and expert audience, no one questioned the very real and credible concerns that had been explained. And everyone there agreed that the delay and the uncertainty being caused by prevarication over EMR was very damaging and making a bad situation worse. And part of the problem, no doubt, is the remarkable turnover of UK energy ministers and the disillusionment that's setting in at DEC, with several high-ranking and very experienced personnel recently leaving. And that's why I'm glad that the Scottish Government is taking such a helpful and such a reasonable attitude. And good evidence for this constructive cooperation is given by the newly published Scottish Islands Renewable Report, prepared on behalf of both the Scottish and the UK governments. And I commend this excellent report to members. It makes the case quite decisively for the enormous renewable energy potential of Scotland's islands. The Minister quite correctly said that the report says that Scotland's islands could produce 5% of the UK electricity need by 2030. But the report also says that ultimately, beyond that, Scotland's islands could produce as much as 20% of the UK's electricity demand. And those islands of Orkney, Shetland and Western Isles would also benefit from a very significant number of jobs. The report suggesting 10,000 jobs on those islands by 2030 and a further 29,000 full-time equivalents across the rest of the UK. And the report outlines how energy generation on islands can be competitive, with the higher costs of generation on islands mitigated by the significantly higher capacity that projects benefit from there. But it did stress that generation projects will only be viable if a fair and reasonable connection and transmission charging regime is provided. And it finally outlines a number of sensible ways in which this can be done. Presiding Officer, the whole point of energy market reform is to keep the lights on at an affordable cost whilst decarbonising our energy supply. And this requires, and I think this is a point that's lost on Rhoda Grant, this requires an integrated UK energy market. And what is sometimes missed is that fundamental to this is also the need, certainly.
Rhoda Grant.
I'll say it again, this is not about having an integrated grid. It is about subsidising another country's energy, renewable energy investments. Will you or will you not make up for the subsidy that will be lost in a separate Scotland?
Through the Chair, Mike Mackenzie, 1 minute left.
Presiding Officer, Rhoda Grant obviously does not understand the concept of the energy market and contracts for difference. What she says would be perfectly valid, quite correct, if renewable energy was subsidised from taxation. It is not subsidised from taxation. It is subsidised by the consumers, the end users of the energy, wherever they happen to be. And what's missed also is that fundamental to the need to keep the lights on is a single and harmonised European energy market. And facilitating this is also part of the purpose of EMR. And Scotland's renewable energy generation capability, and especially that of our islands, will play a very significant role in this.
You must finish.
And in doing this, it will be a source of real prosperity for Scotland.
Many thanks. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by John Wilson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by reiterating an apology to yourself, to the Chamber and particularly to the Minister for my absence at General Questions this morning. I should stress that it wasn't always thus, and I was present for both the EMR debates that the Minister referred to, including the one in January 2011 at the start of the UK Government's consultation. And I think much has happened since then, though the Minister is right in suggesting important questions remain to be answered. Given the scale of what the UK Government is seeking to achieve here, and the range of often competing interests that need to be balanced, that is perhaps not wholly surprising. But I understand and share the impatience to see greater clarity in a number of key areas, not least the shape and extent of future support for those technologies where Scotland enjoys a natural advantage. In that first debate on EMR, I stressed how vital it was that both Scotland's governments worked collaboratively through the process, and it seemed to me that this was the only way of ensuring the final reform package reflected our specific needs and interests. This was and remains very much the view of the energy sector in Scotland, who had absolutely no desire to see SNP ministers picking fights with Westminster counterparts. And I'm pleased to say that Fergus Ewing heeded that message and has engaged methodically and constructively over the last 2 years. He's to be congratulated for that. It's an approach which I'm confident will serve Scotland's interests. Nowhere has this approach been more in evidence than in pursuit of a solution to the grid and charging issues that threaten to hold back development of renewables in our islands, including those I represent in Orkney. I would like to spend a little time on this aspect of where I believe reform is urgently needed and where I expect the Energy Bill to now deliver a solution. The independent analysis commissioned by the joint working group set up by both governments underscores the opportunities and barriers to unlocking the renewable potential of our islands, and the importance of doing so if we are to meet our renewable and climate change targets. This report makes clear the case for reform and the need to change current policy. That policy, of course, was inherited from the previous Labour government, which makes Rhoda Grant's amendment a little hard to fathom. But I welcome the agreement that change is needed and the independent evidence base now underpinning it. With longer-term job-creating potential estimated at 4,500 in Orkney and almost 11,000 across all three main island groups, the prize here is one we must grab with both hands. As I've said in previous debates, there are different options for bringing down costs for connecting Isles-based developments. It could be done through an amended Section 185 order capping the cost of charges, or through providing additional island support via the strike price setting process. Both options have strengths and weaknesses. Both seem to me workable, and the best of these should now be pursued, although I note the Minister seemed to take a preference for the latter. Of course, transmission charging is only part of the mix. Addressing delays in installing and upgrading grid infrastructure must also be a priority, and in that regard I strongly support Scottish Renewables' call for both Scotland's governments to look at drawing down EIB funding to help promote grid investment at a lower cost. Deputy Presiding Officer, I acknowledge Mr Ewing's role in maintaining momentum on this issue of critical importance to all our islands, not simply the Western Isles, as was unfortunately suggested in the Scottish Government's press release back in February. But I think it's also right to recognise the enormous contribution of my Liberal Democrat colleague Ed Davey. The case for reform is well understood and widely supported in Scotland, yet we should not underestimate the institutional, the political and indeed the industry opposition to making concession to our islands that does exist. Ed Davey, I think, is to be commended for the tenacity with which he has pursued a solution in the face of that opposition. So I'm not surprised to see collaboration and indeed historic concordats to the fore in the Government's motion today, which I'm happy to support along with the amendment in Murdo Fraser's name. I see the motion has also been signed by Mr Swinney, who was doubtless keen to cast an eye over it in case Mr Ewing had slipped in a rogue personal view, though I dare say when Mr Ewing read the bulletin this morning and saw Mr Swinney and Mr Mackay had apparently backing effective nuclear deterrent for Scotland, he must have wondered whether the trend in ministers declaring personal views was spreading. Of course, we've heard a great deal about the effect that continued... I'm sorry, I've not really got an awful lot of time, I'm afraid. I'm sure the Minister will correct the record. Of course, we have already heard much about the effect that continued uncertainty is having on the ability of the sector to plan with confidence. As I said earlier, I understand those concerns. I accept the EMR and the other changes taking place are difficult for the energy sector to manage. I firmly believe that, given the significance of the reforms being taken forward, it's absolutely essential we get these right, but delays in coming to final decisions must also be kept to a minimum. Yet, if SNP members insist that uncertainty is a bad thing, and it is, then they need to accept that plans to break up the UK are scarcely going to soothe furrowed brows across the sector. Evidence of this can be found in the David Hume Institute report, in the recent poll of oil and gas firms conducted by Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce. It has also been confirmed by SSE, who say the referendum is being factored in as a risk and a cost in relation to decisions about future investments. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, despite some on the SNP benches trying to claim that there is good uncertainty and bad uncertainty, I acknowledge the broad-based consensus around what this reform process is seeking to achieve in this debate and in the previous debate, and where Scotland's interests lie. These reforms are crucial to Scotland's future energy mix, to the development of our vast renewables potential and CCS technology, to maintaining investor confidence and to reducing emissions while keeping consumer bills as low as possible and the lights on. I welcome today's debate. I support the motion from the Government and the Tory amendment, and I urge the Minister to continue adopting a collaborative and consensual approach to this vital issue, not least in terms of finding an urgent solution to our island's needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before I call John Wilson, can I just say that on the issue Mr McCarthy mentioned, apologies have been issued and the record has been corrected. John Wilson, to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming the motion in the name of the Minister, Fergus Ewing, in this debate initiated in the name of the Scottish Government, and also welcome the sensible amendment from the Conservative Party, less so from the Labour Party. I trust that today's debate on electricity market reform will assist in speeding up the pace of the reforms needed in the electric marketplace. In relation to the UK Government's energy bill, objectives in place a significant element on security of supply with regard to electricity and increasing the opportunity for investment. And clearly other members have mentioned today about the supply and the fears that exist down south in terms of the lights going off. As I have previously stated in the Chamber, the householder has not been particularly best served so far in the current marketplace for energy, particularly electricity. The customer must be at the heart of any reform process, not viewed as an afterthought. In the period since 2004, there had been a percentage increase of over 50% in electricity bills, with further hikes expected in the near future. This has resulted in many people having to make tough decisions as to how they spend their money in these most challenging times. According to the Poverty Social Exclusion in the UK survey report funded by ESRC, of which 2,700 individuals in Scotland were surveyed, the results for Scotland detailed that at least 1 in 6 children live in a home which either suffers from damp or not adequately heated. Furthermore, the report reported by the Consumer Focus Scotland, Keeping the Heat in Scotland's Homes, notes that nearly 1 in 3 Scottish households are now fuel poor. Both these reports show the scale of the problem faced by many low-income households.
I welcome the funding mechanisms put in place by the Scottish Government to try and deal with some of these issues faced by those living in fuel poverty. And looking at the details as proposed in the Energy Bill, then the current constitutional arrangement between what is reserved and devolved does create problems. Although energy matters are generally reserved, the Scottish Government does have a role with regards to some aspects, such as the design of contracts for difference. The Scottish Government anticipates that in terms of delivering its policy focus, that a consistent regulatory approach landscape is appropriate. Electricity market reform forms part of a wider energy agenda in the development of a low-carbon economic strategy that will aim to make Scotland more capable of resisting the volatility associated with ever-increasing energy prices. This is a well-timed debate in regards to Scotland having an increasing role on the global stage, given that as a country we have the potential to produce a quarter of Europe's offshore wind energy potential. The prospects for Scotland's economy are dependent on utilising renewables, particularly when we put it in context that, given the global low-carbon economy is forecast to grow to £4.3 trillion by the year 2015, I am hopeful that principles contained in the UK Energy Bill will better signpost a future of increased investment by developing the principle of a capacity market in respect of delivering generation capacity. Associated with this development is the substantive aim of making Scotland a leading investment centre for low-carbon investments. Presiding Officer, there are a number of issues that we haven't covered and haven't been covered in terms of the electricity market reform. We've heard the issue about tariffs that have been raised by the Conservative amendment, but there are other issues that consumers are facing problems with, and we must address the issue that consumers face in the future, because it is fine to say that we have to look at the reforms and we have to get them right for the market, but we have to get it right for the consumer, because many consumers are being, at the end of the day, asked to pay for the reforms that are being put in place. And without the correct reforms and the reforms that actually benefit consumers, particularly those on low incomes and those in fuel-poor households, then clearly the bill that has been presented by the UK Government fails to address some of the crucial issues that are faced by many people, not only in Scotland but throughout the UK. Presiding Officer, I look forward to witnessing many of the issues discussed in this afternoon's debate being taken forward in the coming months and years, and that both UK and Scottish Governments can develop a reform agenda in the electricity marketplace that ensures real benefits for the people of Scotland. And in closing, Presiding Officer, I support the motion in the name of the Minister and support the amendment on behalf of the Conservatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I apologise for not having my page in front of me. Thank you. As a member of the Economics, Energy and Tourism Committee, I am pleased to participate in this debate. I believe that an integrated UK energy market is the best way forward for Scotland in achieving a low-carbon and good-value energy mix for consumers, and that the electricity market reform is long overdue. The EMR is an excellent opportunity to redress the power balance between consumers and suppliers, as well as boosting investor confidence in renewables technology. However, I feel the opportunity has been missed to address the need for reduction of electricity demand, improvement of access to community ownership of renewables, and to boost the need for greater competition in the market more generally. All these measures are necessary if Scotland means to maintain an energy infrastructure which is not only low carbon, but also low cost, widely accessible and fair. It is imperative that, in working together to deliver reform, the Scottish and UK governments commit to build consumer confidence, participation and understanding on the part of consumers, as well as making a meaningful effort to reduce household energy bills in real terms. One way of doing that is to promote competition in the energy market, forcing energy companies to innovate and diversify. The UK and Scottish Governments have made it clear that they want to encourage greater competition. Reducing the hegemony of the 6 major energy companies has the potential to make electricity more affordable for those in fuel poverty. And by allowing small local enterprises entry to the market, local communities can benefit from energy generated locally. However, the provisions contained in the Energy Bill may unintentionally damage its potential to achieve this stated aim. The bill requires independent energy generators to secure long-term viable power purchase agreements before they will receive funding from banks. Realistically, only the 6 major energy companies have the financial strength and stability to enter into a viable power purchase agreement with independent generators, and the financial incentive to do so has been removed since the EMR does away with renewable obligation certificates. Therefore, very few independent generators will be able to secure PPAs, and as a result, many will not have the financial capacity to invest and grow, threatening their future and narrowing the field of competition in the energy market. While the bill provides for a reduction in the barriers to entry to the market normally presented by PPAs, I believe these provisions do not go far enough to protect and promote independent generators. As regards to contracts for difference, while I welcome the Scottish Government's involvement in delivering this incentive for companies to invest in low-carbon generation, I urge the Minister to carefully consider and act to mitigate the negative impact these contracts may have on community schemes. Community schemes are a fantastic way for consumers vulnerable to fuel poverty to engage in the market, often resulting in fairer, cheaper and more transparent tariffs. However, uptake has been low, and the renewable obligation certificates were an ineffective incentive. EMR is the opportunity to boost uptake and invest in what is widely considered to be a positive alternative to energy supplied exclusively by the Big 6 energy companies to local communities. In its pre-legislative scrutiny on the Energy Bill, the Common Select Committee on Energy and Climate Change noted that the bill was likely to damage the prospect of community enterprises and that the contracts for difference would not allow for community schemes to thrive. Again, by damaging the ability of community ownership of renewables to grow and spread across Scotland, this bill has the potential to consolidate the domination of the Big 6 energy firms, and in so doing weakens competition in the market and the UK's ability to diversify and promote a low-carbon energy mix that is fair on consumers. I urge the Scottish Government, while designing the delivery of the contracts for difference, to address this inadequacy and take action to boost community schemes in Scotland by ensuring that they are as straightforward as possible, eradicating the potential financial uncertainty and complexities of the contracts for difference for community enterprises. Presiding Officer, I believe that the main beneficiaries of any reform of the electricity market should be consumers. I do not believe this to be true of the reforms as they stand, and as such, while I welcome the electricity market reforms in principle, I believe that these unambitious proposals are a missed opportunity. More can and must be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Chick Brodie to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me start by applauding our Government Minister, our committees and indeed this Parliament and their resilience in supporting and in their commitment to the UK's electricity market reforms and of working with the UK Government to try to procure and secure a sustainable and balanced electricity supply industry, specifically in Scotland, but more widely across the UK. But it's not just their resilience we applaud, but their patience as we await the delivery of the UK energy bill and its proposed reforms. A delivery, I regret to say, which has taken longer than the gestation of an elephant. In fact, the gestation of a herd of elephants. To all those who talk, and we've heard it today, of political uncertainties such as the UK's involvement with Europe, in the future there is one great uncertainty. That is that of a delayed, unclear, unstructured energy funding policy as we go forward. And while tariffs and customer bills are exceedingly important, as Murdo Fraser pointed out, the raw component source pricing is fundamental to the reform of the whole market and its demand and supply elements. And in that context, Deputy Presiding Officer, let me dwell on one element of EMR, and that is the likely proposals surrounding the contracts for difference for nuclear energy, the funding of it and the consequences of it diverting significant investment from the preferred options of the components of a more balanced and renewable energy policy harnessed to established decarbonisation targets. When Ed Davey, he of the Anti-Nuclear Power Brigade only 6 years ago, Ed Davey, the UK Secretary of State for Energy, appeared before our Energy Committee last June, he clearly, very clearly, stated there would be no public subsidy for nuclear power, confirming that to be part of the 2010 coalition agreement between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And indeed, it was part of the Conservative manifesto for that very election. He reiterated that position in his evidence to the UK Energy and Climate Change Committee on November the 20th last year. And in a letter to me of March 26th this year, he wrote, and I quote, "We will not provide a subsidy for new nuclear power." But then his letter goes on to say, in reference to the decommissioning of new nuclear build, the government has said that new nuclear developers will have to meet the costs of decommissioning in full. But the funded decommissioning programme, FDP, are included in the calculations of the developers' returns under a contract for difference. For that, read subsidy. And not just a small subsidy. Because, as Professor Tom Burke of Imperial College London put it, if, for example, the strike price is set at the politically sensitive price of £100 per megawatt hour, and the market price is stabilised at £50 per unit, and the government forecast for 2030 is indeed £59 per unit, then a supplier like EDF at Hinkley Point might receive £50 billion in support from the UK over a period of 40 years. And that cannot be transferred simply to consumer bills. And beyond that, EDF want a guarantee, apparently, that the government will buy all possible output from Hinkley Point, not just what, in fact, is needed. So it is little wonder, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the Chairman of Centrica, as the Minister said, confirmed at the recent AGM that nuclear is no longer a cheap option, which is why Centrica withdrew from the project. And dare I even mention the cost setbacks at Flamanville in France, Olkiluoto in Finland, or of Germany closing all its nuclear reactors by 2022, and then, of course, we've had Chernobyl and Fukushima. Deputy Presiding Officer, there is little doubt that the nuclear energy trigger is playing and has played a very significant role in the delay of EMR and its announcement of strike prices. There is, I believe, on the part of the UK Government a rush to determination on this particular issue, which is undermining a sensible energy and economy strategy. The UK Government says there is no deal, for example, no deal with EDF on the £14 billion Hinkley Point nuclear power station. But of course, there will be. There will be, because it cannot afford EDF to withdraw and plunge the UK Government into energy insecurity. And that's where Scotland comes into play when we're talking about demand from south of the border. The UK Government needs economic growth, but its economic policy negates focused public spending. The Treasury's paws are all over this energy market, this electric market reform, and is making the whole energy policy totally unworkable. So private money, private investment, of which there is plenty, will be needed for such nuclear projects. But because of the inherent risks, such investors will be looking for a security, a subsidy through the contracts for difference to secure significant return on investment. Presiding Officer, it's not just securing investment for build. The decommissioning costs of cleaning up the like of Sellafield nuclear waste site has now reached £67.5 billion, that's billion pounds, and is still rising at £1.5 billion per year. And as previously mentioned, this is the economics of the madhouse.
You must finish.
Divestment of that investment into more quickly developed and ultimately cheaper energy is in danger of going into a bottomless pit. We have to transfer that investment from any proposals for nuclear into a much more balanced energy policy.
Thank you very much. Hansala Malik, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak to today's debate on electricity market reform. Presiding Officer, I have grave concerns about the rising household electricity bills. The dominance of small number of companies, coupled with concerns over the security of electricity supply and the falling levels of spare capacity in electricity, which means that unless action is taken urgently, the cost to the consumer will continue to escalate, which must be checked. The increase in household energy bills by £300 since 2010 means that reform of the market is very much needed. And whilst I support some of the measures included in the UK Government Energy Bill, the bill lacks clarity and I believe is not ambitious enough. A lost opportunity, I believe. So, in principle, increasing investment in low carbon and renewable energy through contracts of difference could provide a sound structure to meet our electricity needs. However, further detail is needed on the contract of difference, which is a technical term used in the bill, and the process will be for setting a strike price, once again a technical term used in the bill. But these reforms are for the medium and long-term future of the electricity market. The current structure needs to be radically reformed to increase competition and reduce the cost to the consumer, particularly to our vulnerable who depend heavily in their energy supply at reasonable and fair and affordable costs, and to be able to access good advice and service from their providers to ensure that they have every opportunity to address difficulties in the future. The current structure needs radical reform, as I have said. At present, only 6 companies have 99% of the market share of household energy bills. The question then arises, why only 6 companies? The ambitious proposal to place a requirement on energy companies to pool the power they generate and make it available to any retailer would break the dominance of the 6 main energy companies, allowing price flexibility and not possible price fixing, as some of our oil companies are being accused of today. The other issue which has always puzzled me is why we allow energy companies to charge a surcharge if a customer or a client wishes to move to another provider. Surely that is unfair and unreasonable. People should be free to move around to the best company they wish to deal with, particularly since they're paying for the service. It's not a free service. So, whilst I, in theory, genuinely believe that flexibility is very important, I think what is even more important is that the community, our vulnerable people, have more than just simply affordable energy, they also have companies who they can trust, who can support them in terms of ensuring that they get not only good advice, but also get information in terms of how best they can save energy. Because at the end of the day, I believe saving energy is a very important element of all of this. And I think it is in the best interest of our country, maybe not the companies providing the service, that our communities are well versed with what opportunities are available to them. But I will also ask the Minister to perhaps address that in terms of the bill, is there going to be an additional support to the communities and community groups in particular? I recently visited the Glasgow Athletes Village, in which I was very impressed with some of the measures they have taken in terms of reducing the energy bill and making it cost effective. I'm wondering whether there were going to be any other schemes which will be introduced in the near future to support our communities in trying to address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Mary Scanlon.
Thank you, President Officer. And let me say at the outset I was grateful to you, President Officer, for your useful clarification for the official report that both Mr Mackay and Mr Swinney's names were added by clerical error to Mr Johnson's motion. I think Mr MacArthur's section of the official report could have made for rather misleading reading in future years without that clarification. President Officer, the energy sector is an important one for Scotland. Dennis Robertson suggested that Scotland is the energy capital of Europe. He didn't say, although I have heard him say before, his part of Scotland, the North East, is the energy capital of Scotland. Now, coming on Kilsyth, my constituency is probably not reckoned to be a part of the country immediately and directly involved in that sector. I don't think even I could reasonably claim it as the country's energy capital, but of course we do have in the area Scottish and Southern Energy with its call centre at the Hunt Hill Estate in Cumbernauld is a big employer in the town. We also, at the other end of the town, Scottish Power has its training centre at Delaine House in the Ward Park Industrial Estate. Indeed, the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice both visited that site this week. And I think that is a reminder that the energy sector is an important player right across Scotland. There's a huge importance in many places, and I consider it to be important in my own constituency. So electricity market reform is therefore of obvious interest to me as representing an area with those companies located there, and of course those companies have an obvious interest in the UK Government's proposals. Indeed, the Minister mentioned the perspective of the Chairman of Iberdrola, which is the parent company of Scottish Power, of course, on investment decisions arising as a consequence of the timescale for clarity on detail of electricity market reform from the UK Government. And as an aside, I thought it was interesting that the Minister could name a company that has expressed concerns about uncertainty on investment as a consequence of the UK Government position, but neither Rhoda Grant nor Murdo Fraser could name a single company or point to a single investment decision in relation to renewables that has been affected by the independence referendum. Of course.
Liam MacArthur.
To Jamie Hepburn for taking an intervention. But in the interest of clarity on the record, I did reference the comments of SSE, who have said that they are factoring this in as a risk and a cost to the investment decisions that they are taking.
Jamie Hepburn.
I mean, I don't doubt for a minute that these companies are, of course, interested in the independence referendum and considering the implications of the referendum and independence. But I think the fact of the matter is, when pressed, and it's not just in this area, Presiding Officer, it's right across the whole scope of investment across Scotland, when we hear this suggestion that the independence referendum is causing uncertainty in investment decisions, whenever whoever makes that particular proposition is pressed to name a company, they fail to do so, they cannot do so, and indeed Mr MacArthur couldn't do so either. Briefly.
Mike McKenzie.
Presiding Officer, I wonder if the member agrees with me that it's the fear-mongering of the No campaign that causes uncertainty.
Jamie Hepburn.
I always agree with Mike McKenzie. Let me turn to electricity I think I always agree with Mike Mackenzie. Let me turn to the issue of electricity market reform, because of course that is what we're debating today. Malcolm Chisholm, of course, rightly set out this is primarily a matter for legislation in the UK Parliament for just now. I should, of course, add. And Rhoda Grant was absolutely right then to suggest that we need the Scottish and UK governments to work together in this area, given the split competence the UK Parliament has primary responsibility. Of course, the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government has responsibility as well. But I thought, in suggesting that, there was almost an unspoken suggestion that that isn't happening. Of course, we have the joint concordat that has been signed, so it is clear that that level of cooperation is taking place. I want to return to the issue of Scotland's position in the context of independence, if I may, because it's a suggestion been made that the sector could be harmed. That's been made by a few members, and I want to root it firmly in the process that we're debating today. In the proposals contained in the Energy Bill, the UK is setting up its future market so that generation from outside the UK can work within the GB market. So therefore, under the UK Government's own proposals, contracts for difference would be available to generation in an independent Scotland. And given that we see the UK, the rest of the UK, just as Scotland is looking to improve its environmental performance, reduce its CO2 emissions, when we know that Scotland is so well placed to generate renewable energy in a way that no other part of Europe is, when we know that the UK is reforming the market in a way that companies out with the UK can become involved in that market, it seems ludicrous to posit the suggestion that independence will harm Scotland's energy sector. As part of that process of scaremongering, I have to agree with Mike Mackenzie in that regard. Let me close, Presiding Officer, by saying I think the Scottish Government direction of travel in supporting renewables is absolutely correct. It's necessary over a whole variety of reasons, and I hope that the Energy Bill and electricity market reform process can support that process of encouraging renewables investment. I look very much forward to assessing that as the proposals emerge.
Many thanks. I now call Mary Scanlon to be followed by Dave Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was going to say that I'm pleased to continue the consensual approach, but I had to score that out after I heard Chuck Brodie and Mike Mackenzie and Jamie Hepburn, etc. So that's that part of the speech gone. But I would like to start by commending the Minister, Fergus Ewing, for his ongoing commitment to work with the United Kingdom Government to secure the best outcome for Scotland's electricity supply industry and consumers. Good communications and relations between the UK and Scottish Governments are essential for market reform, and working towards consultation of the Electricity Market Reform Delivery Plan, due to be published in draft in 2 months. And even the First Minister, and I quote, states, "We will continue to work closely with the United Kingdom Government in the development of these measures, both around EMR and in other energy-related areas." Now, I don't think people out there want to see us in an energy debate where we're facing the lights going out in 2 years, sitting, bickering and arguing about independence and a separate Scotland. I think they simply want to know the lights will be on in 2 years' time. And again, I welcome the Minister's approach. Ofgem highlighted that the spare generation capacity on the system could fall from 14% to 4% by 2015, and that coal-fired generation is likely to close much earlier than expected under EU environmental legislation, making the risk of a shortfall in electricity as close as 2 years away. So this background confirms the need for the electricity market reform and the need for many of the measures before us today. The 106-page report on Scottish Island renewables this week marks the end of the first phase of the intergovernmental work to understand the barriers and the opportunities to generation on the Scottish Islands. I welcomed the advance notice of this from the Minister and his email stating that a robust analysis of all options by DEC, Scottish and UK Government will be completed this summer. And as others have said, the report makes it absolutely clear that Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles can make a cost-effective contribution to 2020 renewables and decarbonisation if issues around grid access and high transmission charging are addressed. We've had many statements in this Parliament of the conclusions and recommendations that still haven't been reached. And today, as the Minister said, as a step along the way, it's an opportunity to highlight the renewable resource potential of the Scottish Islands, as well as the socio-economic and the wider benefits of island renewables in terms of jobs, developing supply chains and, indeed, security of supply. The challenges outlined in the Islands Renewable Report include the funding gap, early-stage funding for marine projects, support for the supply chain, the need for anchor projects and, of course, the most contentious being grid access. The study concludes that the cost of deploying renewables on a large scale on the islands is high, given their technological and environmental challenges. Ironically, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to build towers and turbines in high wind conditions. And I got that information from my son, who works in that sector. But according to the report, onshore wind has higher yields, it is cost competitive and significantly cheaper than round 3 offshore wind. And that's why a coordinated policy response is urgently required, particularly given that the current locational charging model, with the figures used by the Minister, was established 8 years ago, when renewable energy and climate change targets were not at the centre of public policy. I would also say that the current charging is Labour Party policy, which is quite surprising that they're actually criticising us for making and addressing this change. So I would also trust that any new charging methodology for the islands would be in accordance with the 2 EU directives on renewable energy and the internal market for electricity, both of which enshrine the principle of non-discrimination between mainland and islands, as well as the other EU laws. So our amendment relates to Ofgem's principal duty to protect existing and future consumers by keeping costs as low as possible for consumers, while promoting security of supply and facilitating the move to a low-carbon future. No one can doubt the commitment of the UK Government and Ofgem when it comes to addressing the mis-selling of energy to consumers. The £10 million fine to Scottish and Southern is a warning to other suppliers to get their act together in terms of offering consumers the best possible energy tariff with no tricks and no loopholes. The complex and confusing array of tariffs have been a disincentive to consumers to switch, and even when they did, they found the gains were often short-lived and not worth the hassle. And I would hope that Tanzala Malik, if he finds anyone in his constituency who is any supplier who is not adhering to these guidelines, I would hope that he will take that to Ofgem. So, finally, Presiding Officer, I commend the pluralist approach by the Scottish and United Kingdom governments to electricity market reform, and I trust that we will get the transmission charging regime for the islands that they need in order to progress with investment and development into renewable, marine and tidal energy.
Thank you very much. I now call Dave Thompson, to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to deal with geographic variations in the prices offered to consumers as part of this. And just to let you know, I received a leaflet from one of the suppliers which included a breakdown of the regional differences in unit price across the UK. The north of Scotland is consistently one of the most expensive regions, with a difference between 1.13 pence and 1.6 pence per unit between the unit price charged in the north and that charged in the south of Scotland. For example, on the general domestic tariff, consumers in the north of Scotland pay 13.77 pence per unit. Those in the south of Scotland pay 12.45 pence per unit, whilst those in Yorkshire get a unit for 12.12 pence. a difference between the North and Yorkshire of 14%. This is replicated in some of the other tariffs. The Economy 7 tariff has 16.34 pence per day unit in the North, compared to 15.21 pence in the south of Scotland, with Yorkshire at 14.76 pence, a difference of 11%. And equally on the Economy 10 tariff, there is a difference of 10% between Yorkshire and the north of Scotland. Now, this is a huge and unfair difference, which I believe is unjustified. Consumers in the north of Scotland and in Skylach, and Badenoch also face a double whammy, with homes being difficult to insulate, which further increased our costs. So whatever review of electricity systems that we have, we've got to bear in mind that we have to have a level playing field across the country in terms of charges to consumers. And I hope this is something that will be addressed in the future. And these high costs in the north are despite the fact that the most remote parts of Scotland have some of the best potential renewable resources in the European Union and existing hydropower. Just last week, SSE confirmed it will proceed with the Glassa development near Ardrost, a new £30 million hydro scheme, and the largest to be built in the UK for 5 years. SSE has also proposed a huge 600-megawatt pumped storage hydro scheme, Corriglass, on Loch Lochy. At Kylree, the proposed tidal array has attracted over £15 million in European funding through the NER 300 programme, one of only 23 renewable schemes throughout the EU to share a £1 billion funding stream. There are countless other examples along the west coast, in the Murray Firth and around Shetland and Orkney, and yet consumers in the Highlands and Islands face amongst the highest bills in the UK. The cost of fuel has risen substantially, as we will all know, for consumers across Scotland in recent years. And as the cost of heating our homes accounts for a greater part of families' budgets, these geographic differences seem increasingly unjustifiable, and future policy must ensure a level playing field for all consumers in the UK. Yes, give way to Mary Scanlon.
Yes, I just wonder if the member has reported this supplier to Ofgem, given the new guidelines and proposals that they are implementing in the forthcoming months.
Dave Thompson.
Well, I would certainly hope that Ofgem would pick up on these things. These are tariffs that were given to me not that long ago. They've been in place for an awful long time, and it's absolutely scandalous that the folk in the Highlands are paying more than people in other parts of Scotland or the UK, for that matter. The second issue I'd like to touch on relates to community benefit from sources of renewables. There are numerous good practice guidelines and systems to deal with the distribution of community benefit. For example, Highland Council have published guidelines where the amount of community benefit is distributed between the local community, an area-wide fund and the Highland Trust Fund, so that everybody benefits. And much of the existing good practice guidelines are generally for developments of onshore wind. But as new renewable technologies approach maturity, we will see an increasing number of offshore developments, such as tidal arrays and offshore wind farms and wave farms as well. It's important that we recognise this and develop a robust framework to ensure coastal and other communities get a fair share of community benefit in the coming years. Offshore resources will make a huge contribution to Scotland's ambitious renewable energy targets, will secure jobs in the renewable energy industry and also bring significant profits for the developers and benefits to the country. It is right, therefore, that we are prepared to ensure that some of the money involved will also go to our coastal communities. And for that to happen, we must have a robust community benefit system. A system must be set in place to ensure that the riches from areas like the West Highlands don't just flow out of the area, but directly benefit local communities as well. Remote areas where the best resources are located will gain some improvements to infrastructure, but we must do better than that. As well as direct community benefit, we must also feed back some of the bonanza to West Coast communities. The Government must look favourably at extensive infrastructure improvements to our roads, rail, ferry and air infrastructure from the benefits we are going to get from this West Coast renewable energy. If huge amounts of money are coming out of the West Highlands and Skye, then surely it is not unreasonable to ask that some of it goes back in again.
Thank you very much. I now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by John Mason. 6 minutes, please, or thereby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Our priority in any debate on this subject must be, as John Wilson said earlier, the interests of consumers. But we must also take into account the impact that energy provision has upon the environment. Ensuring an affordable and dependable energy supply to the general public and Scottish businesses, whilst encouraging the provision of sustainable energy, should be our paramount objective, but with a focus also on reducing consumption. The motion put forward by Fergus Ewing raises some important points relative to the reform of the electricity market. But whilst I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement of intergovernmental cooperation and the concordat, I do believe the motion concentrates too much on the self-congratulation and not enough on how this Scottish Government will deal with the challenges that we continue to face. I, like the majority of other members, am concerned about our dependence on one form of energy production, and therefore welcome the move from a reliance on fossil fuels to a more diverse and renewable energy mix. I believe that a move towards renewable energy can, by its very nature, only be a good thing. The Scottish Government has pledged that by 2020, 100% of Scotland's energy will come from renewable sources, up from 38.69% currently. This is an ambitious target, and I do hope that ministers are not determined to achieve it at any cost. When dealing with the electricity market reforms, I must remind the Cabinet Secretary of constituents' concerns across the south of Scotland on the impact of wind farms on local communities, their wildlife economies, and hope that ministers will take these concerns seriously when planning the way forward on reform. Within the UK Energy Bill, the principle behind the introduction of the Contracts for Difference policy, designed to incentivise investment in low-carbon energy, is admirable. But the lack of detailed information on this element leaves me wondering if it has been fully thought through and is deliverable. It is worth noting that under the current system, Scotland's much-heralded renewables market receives a third of the UK's total investment, despite contributing around a tenth of the funds. I do wonder how this funding would be replaced should SNP members get their wish next year. The principle behind localised community renewable generators is also desirable, but the Government must ensure that issues such as the cost of liabilities and maintenance are fully considered when dealing with market reform. I believe that community ownership has real potential to empower local communities and offset any negative impact on developments, but it must be done with due consideration and care and with the interests of the community at heart. I must again emphasise the importance of prioritising communities and consumers who will be most affected by the issues being discussed. One of my major concerns regarding the energy market is the apparent continual and disproportionate increase in the cost to consumers. Over the past 6 months, each of the so-called Big Six energy providers, who together supply 99% of UK households, have implemented price rises between 6 and 10%. An average increase of almost £300 in 3 years is absolutely unacceptable. With the Chief Executive of Ofgem, Alistair Buchanan, warning that falls in UK power production capacity are likely to lead to more energy imports and further price rises, it's essential that we act now to minimise increases and deal with the impact on business and consumer confidence for the future in terms of affordability. It is estimated that around 30% of Scottish households are currently classed as being in fuel poverty. The idea that almost a third of people are living in fuel poverty is what is supposed to be one of the most energy-rich countries in the world is frankly embarrassing. Measures such as a requirement for energy companies to place all over 75s, the most vulnerable to increases in fuel prices, on their cheapest tariffs should save hundreds of pounds for millions of pensioners. There is also still a distinct lack of clarity regarding the SNP plans for the regulatory regime and energy system in an independent Scotland. The reform of the electric market must be done in a transparent and open way so that consumers and providers alike will know exactly where they stand. The UK Energy Bill fails to adequately address the recent escalation in energy bills or the ongoing threat to fuel poverty, and does not include sufficient measures to reduce electricity demands. I hope the Cabinet Secretary can give us some comfort in these regards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on John Mason, to be followed by Alison Johnson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It certainly seems to me that the Electricity Market Reform Policy Overview of November last year has correctly highlighted the three objectives as to keeping the lights on, keeping energy bills affordable and decarbonising energy generation. I think most of us are signed up to that, and it's encouraging that both the UK and Scottish Governments seem to be taking a reasonably joined-up approach, while there are still differences between them. So I think the question is, how are we to fulfil all of these objectives and get the right balance between them? In addition, we need to look at the long term and not just at the short term. And that's the point I'd like to speak on first. Whatever form of energy and electricity we are to produce, there needs to be investment in the short term now in order to ensure long-term supplies. That includes investment in both generation and distribution. There was an article in today's Herald headed "Grid pays £6 million to turn off wind farm turbines," which, perhaps not unusually, was a slightly dramatic headline for the Herald, whereas the article was actually more reasonable. Because actually the problem here is not so much the fact that it's wind energy that's involved, but the fact that the grid is needing developed. And in fact, the article... yes?
Brody. Thank you for taking the intervention. I too saw that article. It would not surprise the member that Mr Mason, that the Longannet, the coal power station, received £4 million for constraint payments compared to the £1 million for wind farms. So is he prepared to comment on that?
Yes, given that I'd read the article as well, I had read that. And the next line of my speech says, in fact, the article points out that Longannet and Peterhead also received constraint payments. Now, politicians are sometimes accused of only looking at the short term, but I think the private sector can be guilty of that as well. And, for example, in the past, we've had the situation that not sufficient investment was made in oil refining capacity around the world. One of the encouragements we are seeing at the present time is the huge investment in North Sea, and that is a reflection of the long-term confidence in oil and gas there. And clearly, although the Constitution has been mentioned already this afternoon, that has not been a major problem for these investors. The result of all this is that when we buy petrol at the pump or gas off the mains, part of the price is for the longer-term investment. And that is true of almost anything we buy, whether it's a loaf of bread or a pint of beer. Similarly, we need to take a long-term view of other sources of energy, and especially that is true of new forms of energy, namely renewables. Nuclear has been subsidised for a very long time and clearly cannot be operated without a subsidy. Now, my father worked for his whole life for South of Scotland Electricity Board, Scottish Power or their predecessors, and he, I have to say, was a fan of nuclear generation. And I remember going out on a family day to visit Hunterston. However, the idea that nuclear was going to be virtually free electricity, which I think he and his generation hoped for, is now clearly seen to have been a pipe dream. And it's also clear that coal, oil, gas and uranium are finite materials. One of these days they will run out, and even measured uranium resources are only something like 70 to 100 years. We want India, China and others to develop into modern economies, and that means they will need increasing amounts of electricity. So we have a duty in this country, to both this country and to future generations, to produce more renewable energy to replace the fossil fuels. But I believe we also have a duty to those developing economies around the world to contribute our share to carbon reduction. And that's why I think a key contribution that Scotland can make is in universities like Strathclyde, which are respected worldwide and are responsible for bringing a considerable degree of investment to this country. Can I just say too at this stage that one of the reasons we have high fuel prices is the weakness of the pound. Although exporters can be glad when the pound has devalued over the years, and of course now it's about 85 pence to the euro when it was 70 pence for a long period, the downside is that anything we buy in world markets is more expensive, and that certainly includes fuel. One could say that it is one of the failures of successive UK governments that policies have led to a devaluation of the pound. So I believe one of the big advantages of investing in renewables now is that it reduces our reliance on imports and we are less vulnerable to a weak pound in the future. Now, I don't often get to speak on energy and these matters, so I'd like to just range a little bit wider in my closing remarks. I was saying earlier that my father took me to Hunterston, and another memory I have of him is that when we went on holiday in the Highlands, he would admire and point out to us the electricity cables sweeping through the glens, and he was particularly pleased when the individual pylons did not interrupt the sweep of the cables. Now, some people would say that renewables mean spoiling the landscape, but they do also say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. My father found the pylons could be beautiful, and I'm not sure I entirely agreed with him on that. But I do think the wind turbines we have now look superb. They make the M74 much more interesting to drive down, and on Easter Sunday I walked the dog at Whiteley near Eaglesham, and it really is impressive. It clearly is a tourist attraction in its own right, drawing both locals and folk from further afield. When we discuss the electricity market, I think we need to say that we should not be where we are now. I, for one, opposed privatisation in 1991 and did not buy any of the shares on sale at that time. It still seems ridiculous to me that the same electricity is coming out the same wire, but we can be paying different companies for it. It is an artificial market as far as I am concerned. But we are where we are, and clearly I do not see that nationalisation is a realistic option, given the other demands that we have on our finances. So, in conclusion, I welcome today's motion from the Government. I hope we can work together with UK and other European neighbours, and I would urge that we take a long-term view and encourage investment for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Alison Johnson to be followed by Rob Gibson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The public would be forgiven for thinking energy policy is entirely devolved to this Parliament. We discuss it and debate it at length, and quite rightly so, because it's extremely important. We all in the Chamber believe Scotland's energy supply must be affordable, secure and decarbonised. But it is important to remember that we'll only achieve those three things with a reduction in overall demand, a point I'll come back to. This debate reminds us that energy is largely reserved, and important decisions that will set the terms of energy investment in the UK across the coming decades will soon be made in Westminster. I'm pleased the Scottish Government have made sure they're at the table when it comes to setting the contracts for difference and the EMR delivery plan. This Government has done a good job, with the powers it has, of promoting renewables, and I urge them to continue efforts to make sure renewables and low-carbon technologies are supported. The current UK renewable obligation support mechanism works. Many renewable projects and innovations have been made possible because of RO, and CFD must deliver too for renewables and give investment certainty. Hopefully this job has been made slightly easier. During the last EMR debate, the Minister lamented the departure of Charles Hendry. I, for one, am less sad to see John Hayes go. Many have said his anti-renewable stance was spooking investors, and he has been quietly moved on. Getting support right for renewables is vital and seems possible, but EMR also seems very likely to hand out vast subsidies to new nuclear power stations. This will divert investment away from faster, less costly, more job-rich and more secure means of meeting our energy needs, such as interconnection, energy efficiency and renewables. The nuclear industry has been telling us for years that they are the cheapest form of energy. Caroline Lucas, my Green colleague in Westminster, has tabled an amendment to the bill to ensure nuclear does not receive payments that exceed the cheapest renewables. And if the nuclear industry's claims are correct, they should have no qualms supporting the Greens on this. The Scottish Government needs to ensure in its negotiations with the UK Government that renewables are placed as a priority above the nuclear industry, as the integrated UK energy market that the motion welcomes. It's clear that the cost of nuclear subsidies will be borne by consumers in Scotland too. I've argued for continued support for renewables and against the same for nuclear. And it's important that the energy bill does not enable the dash for gas that many commentators fear.
And in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee's report on the achievability of Scotland's renewable targets, we concluded that the targets were achievable, but only by addressing a number of issues. And one of the priorities highlighted was for the Scottish Government's engagement with the UK over the energy bill, was a revision of the emissions performance standard that does not create incentives which will lead to investment being unduly diverted from renewables to gas. The emissions performance standard is one of the few tools the Government has to tackle the most polluting power stations and encourage the almost complete decarbonisation of the power sector that the UK Committee on Climate Change say is necessary by 2030. As Rhoda Grant has highlighted, the Government seemed to be in no mood to try to reduce the UK's pointlessly high EPS or set a Scottish-specific one to lead the way. The LCM's report details the amendments Labour and I lodged and our dissent from the recommendation to Parliament. Finally, I want to talk about alternatives. This UK energy bill entrenches the dominance of the big six energy companies who have not delivered affordable energy. 26,000 people were added to the fuel poor in Scotland last year, largely as a result of fuel price increases. This could have been many more were it not for government-led energy efficiency measures, which can, of course, always be improved upon. For an alternative, we can look not so far away to Germany and a case reported by Alan Simpson, the ex-Labour MP. In a small town called Schonau in the Black Forest, a feisty primary school teacher called Ursula Sladek and others decided that they wanted to buy non-nuclear energy and consume less at that. An approach to the local energy company failed, but after a 5-year battle, the community took ownership of the local grid and could supply their own energy. This idea took hold, and there are now 600 community energy companies democratising Germany's energy market. Several years ago, they too were dominated by their own Big Four. But now, over half of the 60 gigawatts of renewable energy that has been installed in less than a decade is citizen or community-owned. This is delivering cheaper, cleaner energy, but importantly, it's an energy market not dominated by a few players, but owned and controlled by citizens. And I think this is a vision that we in Scotland should aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Rob Gibson, after which we'll move to the closing speeches. 6 minutes, please, Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In electricity market reform, we aim for stability, but unfortunately inherit uncertainty in the way in which that stability is going to be delivered. And I'd like to look at some of the origins of that, first of all, before looking at some of the effects. And earlier in this year, delivering renewable energy under devolution, an academic study done in the 4 parts of the UK, led by Dr. Richard Cowell, this showed that we can point to a range of actions by the devolved governments, especially Scotland, that have shown significant support to renewable energy in the UK. But let's be quite clear. It also shows that the capacity, the main policy-making powers and capacity lie in London, with DEC and the Treasury playing central roles. So our energy policy in Scotland is very much a part of the devolved settlement. It's followed a model which was created in London, and indeed they go on in their conclusions of that report to point out that among the devolved governments, political commitment to large-scale renewable energy development is longest standing in Scotland, being evident in the 1999 elections, allowing debates about delivery to develop sooner than in Northern Ireland and Wales. So we can see that the issue of getting large-scale renewable energy is something which came in with devolution. And we also know that the ROCs were set up in a fashion in 2002 under the Labour government. So we've been following a model which emphasised the creation of large-scale development. And Alison Johnston's pointed out that our alternatives, Denmark and Germany, did start to build from the bottom up in many cases, or indeed dismantle the top and create more local control. That is entirely potential for our future as well. But I would have to say that we need to recognise that in order to get the stability I talked about at the beginning, that we have to be sure that the contracts for difference will actually deliver that. And that is uncertain in the minds of the electricity industry. Scottish and Southern Energy said on the 1st of May this year that, however, renewable developers do not have certainty over how the contracts for difference will work in practice when the renewable obligations closes to new projects which are expected to begin generating after March 2017. This uncertainty has led to an investment freeze from those projects which are not certain to commission by that date. This freeze will exacerbate in 2013 as more projects reach the stage at which significant development investment is needed. So, getting some security of investment is clearly a major part of the stability that we're talking about. And it's underlined by the reason why we're having a renewables policy in the first place, and that stems from the necessity to tackle climate change. And in the most recent report in March this year from the UK Committee on Climate Change, I may have mentioned part of this before, but it bears repeating. The Scottish Government has helped to provide longer-term certainty for industry by setting a 2030 decarbonisation target, which is in line with the Committee's recommendations. However, uncertainty over post-2020 support at the UK level may feed back to current investment decisions. So they reflect what the producers like SSE have said, that there is uncertainty in the process. And it bothers me intensely for those of us who represent areas that can possibly make a big contribution to this. In an attempt to try and argue about the UK market being more stable than a Scottish one, Ed Davey said in March the 19th, I think in Aberdeen, that Scottish electricity generators had unhindered access to a market of more than 23 million households. Well, I don't see the producers in the islands or the Highlands having an unhindered access. I see a transmission system that makes it impossible for them to contribute on a level playing field in this matter. And I would suggest to you that that is something which the electricity market reforms have to address clearly. The evidence of our Minister, Fergus Ewing, helping with the Islands project very much also points to the fact that even electricity landed on the mainland in the north of Scotland is going to have a huge problem. Now, to deal with this question about what Britain requires, decarbonisation, as I said, is at the heart of this, and in a report from Scottish Renewables, also on the 1st of May, it points out that the UK Government estimates that in 2011, renewable electricity generation in Scotland displaced over 8.3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. This is the equivalent of over 15% of Scotland's total carbon emissions. Onshore wind makes up the largest percentage of this generation. Furthermore, in response to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, National Grid showed that between April 2011 and September 2012, the electricity generated by wind farms in Britain resulted in an estimated 10.9 million tonnes less CO2 being emitted. There is never likely to be as much production of wind in England, so I would argue that indeed Britain will require Scotland's production of clean energy in order to help meet the UK targets or England's targets in future.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alex Johnson to close on behalf of the Conservative Party. Up to 7 minutes, please, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been a very interesting debate, and one that I think I need to set a slightly different backdrop to from that has been used by some of the people who have participated. The United Kingdom was very lucky in that by the mid-1990s we had a very stable and well-developed power generation system. It was diverse. We had nuclear, we had coal and we had gas. And here in Scotland we had a significant overcapacity in our ability to produce electricity for our domestic market. Sadly, I think that good record of the previous Conservative government in controlling energy policy left us in a position where we were overconfident. The subsequent Labour government nationally did rest on its laurels for rather too long, and took too long to come forward with its proposals for developing the electricity market in the longer term. In fact, it has to be pointed out that the current grid access and charging arrangements have been in place for 8 years and were put in place by a Labour government in the south at a time when there was a Labour government in effect here in Scotland too. So it is remarkable that the criticisms that we've had today seem to take into account nothing of that past record. However, my understanding of the situation we have in Scotland is that our own SNP government have been in power for a number of years now, and during that period they have used the luxury of overcapacity to concentrate their energy policy on the extension of onshore wind power. Now, there's a lot said about onshore wind, some positive, some negative, and I will never deny that it has a significant place within a balanced energy policy. But the fact that we have become so reliant on it to replace that capacity which we're going to lose has left us in an exposed position. And that exposed position is something else which has come to be discussed in this discussion today. Indeed.
Would Alec Johnson accept with me that the success of onshore wind has provided the rationale which has allowed National Grid and Ofgem to approve upgrades of the grid on a massive scale, and that without that grid upgrade there cannot be any offshore wind, tidal or wave energy, and therefore the success of onshore wind is a stepping stone to other forms of renewable energy?
Alex Johnson.
I think the Minister exaggerates his case. There is obviously a case for improving grid connections to the north and west in order to accommodate the current proposals for onshore wind in the far-flung areas and in the islands. However, the bulk of proposals for development of offshore wind are in the east, and while they will require their own specific connections to the grid, they are in effect in a position to access the existing grid as it is. However, I'd like to say a bit about the attitude towards markets. And one of the reasons why the Conservatives have found themselves in a position to agree with the Government motion today, and I hope the reason why the Government have come to agree our amendment, is that I think we have an understanding of the function of markets which is not dissimilar. Our understanding is that the function of a market is to balance supply and demand. It is to ensure that there is an adequate price for power, which will deliver enough investment to continue to develop the grid where necessary, and, in an ideal situation, will be able to produce affordable electricity, both for domestic and for industrial consumption. I am concerned, therefore, that some of the interpretations of market and the effects of market, which we have heard from the Labour Party today, are not entirely consistent with my understanding of that effect. In fact, we have heard proposals discussed, such as the pooling of power, which may actually serve to undermine the opportunities which the current government in Westminster are trying to produce in order to achieve competition and effective pricing for the domestic market. So I will have to find out much more about what it is Labour are trying to put forward and try to work out whether that actually corresponds to my understanding of markets. During the course of the debate, we have heard a number of interesting points put forward, some which I find easier to understand than others. We heard Chick Brodie delivering his normal scaremongering attack on the nuclear power industry. I trust the air at least still has some bonny lassies. Indeed.
I know it's very difficult, and thank you for taking the intervention. I know it's very difficult for Conservatives to empathise with us on each of the following counts. I would remind you that Ayr is a town of honest men and bonny lasses.
Indeed, my reference to the bonny lassies was to cast doubt on the existence of the honest men.
Stick to parliamentary language here, Mr Johnston. You have another 2.5 minutes.
I apologise, Deputy Presiding Officer. The one area of considerable discussion was the effect that separation between Scotland and England may actually have on the electricity market. It was, of course, pointed out by a number of people that Scotland's perhaps over-investment in wind energy could take us to a point where, if there was a separation, there could be considerable costs falling on Scottish consumers. Now, I don't think we got to the bottom of that argument in this discussion today, as we've failed to do so in the past. Mike McKinsey spoke at some length about the fact that, of course, it's not the taxpayer who pays the subsidy for renewable energy, it is the consumer who pays that subsidy. However, if we find ourselves in a single grid but a separate market, we could find ourselves in the very difficult position where Scotland's renewable energy industry will have to compete across a grid with electricity supplied perhaps from other European countries and which may be generated on a more stable and predictable basis. We must remember that if we are relying on that broader market to produce the subsidy for our wind energy, then there is a danger that those in the south may choose to get their carbon-free electricity from a French industry reliant on nuclear power and perfectly willing to significantly undercut the Scottish industry. In coming to a close, I think it is essential that we remember that this electricity market is a UK-wide one. It's one that Scotland's diverse requirements are served well by, and that our pursuit of onshore wind and other renewables requires a stable market. And that grid has the capacity to produce that stable market, and separation may actually undermine that opportunity.
Many thanks. Now call on Mr McIntosh on behalf of the Labour Party. 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And this has been a relatively thoughtful, a relatively consensual and a relatively constructive debate, all of which is to be welcomed. I will admit, I think, along with Murdo Fraser and Malcolm Chisholm, I was slightly surprised to see the terms of the motion. It did, as expected, laud the efforts of the Scottish Government, but it also praised the efforts of the UK Government. In fact, it went on to welcome the UK and Scottish Governments working together, not just once, but twice. And then I think in his opening statement, the Minister said, in announcing his concordat, talked about the continuing and enduring joint working between governments. I think the only phrase missing from all of this is that better together. I think. But all this mutual backslapping and talk of securing best outcomes, I'm afraid, just to me seems slightly misplaced when the industry is clearly worried about delay and uncertainty, about lack of clarity, particularly over renewables, and the consequent lack of investment. In fact, the Minister himself in his remarks actually used some of this language. Concerns over security of supply, about levels of capacity. It seems particularly misplaced when families are struggling with growing fuel poverty, angry at the profits and the bonus culture of the big six power companies, and anxious at a bill which may bolster the dominance of those very companies at the expense of independent renewable companies and leaving community ownership for the most place untapped and undeveloped. We in Scottish Labour believe that Scotland will benefit from an energy policy that balances our energy needs with our climate change and carbon reduction targets, but which also puts our interests as consumers central to any process of reform. So while we do support some of the measures in the UK Energy Bill, we believe it lacks ambition, and as my colleague Rhoda Grant highlighted, there's been a remarkable lack of progress. Now, there are a number of factors in the background to the EMR which are worth highlighting. The big six energy companies are responsible for 99% of household energy bills, bills which have increased by nearly £300 just in the last 3 years alone. Security of supply is an increasing concern raised by several members in the debate, and Ofgem has projected that the UK's spare capacity will fall from 14% at present to 4% in 2 years. The Energy Bill does purport to increase investment in low-carbon and renewable energy, but it doesn't set decarbonisation targets. So, for example, although we in Labour do support the principle behind contracts for difference, there remains a lack of information on vital details, most notably the process for setting strike prices. And in addition to this, concerns have been raised about the ability of community renewables and small independent electricity generators to access finance under the new regime. And I thought Margaret McDougall actually made a particularly useful contribution on this point. Many of us speaking in the energy debate today will have heard from the renewable independent renewable energy generators group. They currently operate more than a fifth of UK onshore wind generation, responsible for some 2/5 of the proposed new projects. But in order to secure financial backing, the independent generators have to secure long-term contracts with creditworthy partners, in practice one of the big six. And already, due to the uncertainty over EMR, fewer energy companies are now offering terms to those generators. And this could not just prove a threat to them, but to our chance of reaching government targets. It will have a further impact on communities, which I'll come back to. But another uncertainty surrounds the impact of the emissions performance standard. This is something that Malcolm Chisholm, I think, raised particularly well acutely. The EPS imposes a limit on the level of carbon emitted by the new power stations. The limit has been set fairly high and will be grandfathered until 2045. But the lack of ambition in this EPS target has raised concern that it will provoke a dash for gas. What's not clear, and I believe the Minister was asked in committee by my colleague Rhoda Grant and again this afternoon, is whether the Scottish Government will have unilateral power to alter the EPS in Scotland without recourse to the original Westminster Bill, now that we are in the process of agreeing an LCM. So can I ask the Minister if he is in a position in his closing remarks to clarify this point? The Minister himself, as well as several members, Liam MacArthur and others, highlighted the recently published Scotland's Islands Renewables Project. This report confirmed the sizeable potential of renewables capacity in the Scottish Islands. It also identified the significant socio-economic benefits which could be unlocked. Sufficient investment could secure up to 400 jobs in the Western Isles, more than 400 in each of both Orkney and Shetland, and an additional 3,000 jobs in the rest of Scotland or elsewhere in the UK over the next 7 years. However, the report concluded that further renewable generation on the Scottish Islands will not be developed on any scale under current policy, primarily due to lack of funding and the high costs of transmission. Now, this is a matter of urgency. Just before Christmas, SHE Transmission announced delays to every upgrade project in Scotland associated with renewables, except for Beauly-Denny. On the specific connector to the Western Isles, SSE have said that they have already missed their window to have the high-voltage connector in by 2016, and my colleague Rhoda Grant commented that Scottish and Southern Energy could lose their procurement contract on new cable. Now, we certainly back the Island Report's conclusions, which say that coordinated policy and regulatory response is required urgently. I welcome the Minister's opening remarks, which talked about proposing a CFD uplift and also to jointly underwrite subsea cables. Can I ask the Minister, what will the Minister do if further support from the UK Government is not forthcoming? I want to turn, if I can, just for a close, on two very important points, however, raised by a number of members. This is fuel poverty. Hans-Alan Malik talked about his concern over rising household electricity bills. Graham Pearson, Mary Scanlon talked about this. Dave Thompson, I think, particularly highlighted the unacceptable regional variations. John Wilson, typically thoughtful comments on the impact of fuel poverty in families in Scotland. And at the moment, Energy Action Scotland estimate that there may be upwards of 600,000 families in fuel poverty. Now, Labour, as you know, set the eradication targets for fuel poverty. We introduced the winter fuel allowance. We introduced free central heating for older people. So you won't be surprised that we want to see further measures. And I would hope you would also not be surprised at our disappointment at the Scottish Government's apparent backsliding on the issue of energy standards in new buildings. Those who can afford to do so will fit small-scale renewables to their property or insulate their homes, but those who cannot afford those measures will fall further into fuel poverty. The Association for the Conservation of Energy has sent a letter to Mr Swinney and to Mr Mackay last week, warning that if he waters down and delays energy standards in new buildings, it will have a severe and damaging effect on energy efficiency. I hope the Minister will raise this issue with... I won't, Mr Mackenzie, if you don't mind. I hope the Minister will raise this issue with his colleagues, because clearly there is a cross-party and cross-parliamentary consensus and support for further measures. Before I close, I just want to mention a very important issue raised by Alison Johnson, Rob Gibson, Dave Thompson, I think virtually all the Labour members, and that's community ownership. Now, I was delighted to be present for the official opening of the Neilson Community Wind Farm earlier this week. Yes, Nicola Sturgeon came to open it, and it's jointly owned by the local community. It's now beginning to generate a substantial income for the village. But community ownership models at Neilson are very much the exception. I think it's fair to say that up to 90% of profits from wind farms are exported, along with 75% of the expenditure on the industry. We are in danger, if I may put it like this, of repeating the same mistakes we made with the oil industry. In fact, even within the tenth of the industry that may be more locally owned, there was a very interesting article in the Scotsman today where Alison Elliott highlights the fact that wealthy landlords are more likely to benefit from public subsidies for renewables rather than local or fuel-poor communities. It's probably safe to say that as little as 3% of renewable energy is owned by communities. Now, we need to be more strategic. The Scottish Government itself needs to show more leadership around funding, risk and planning. The use of Forestry Commission lands, very welcome. What about using more Scottish water resources? Or we could explore the potential of some of our housing associations who have the land and the communities. I think it will help, not just help those communities, but help reach our targets. I'm conscious of the time, Presiding Officer. I haven't had a chance to mention hydroelectricity, which I think is still very important and could be affected, particularly by the feed-in tariffs. But I would urge both governments to tackle the uncertainty and the lack of clarity around EMR with a real sense of urgency. And I support the amendment in my colleague's name.
I now call Fergus Ewing to wind up the debate. Minister, I would be obliged if you could continue until 4:59.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will do my best to oblige. I think this has been a very useful debate, and there's been a number of excellent contributions, and by and large I think the tone has been largely positive. And I want to start off by just trying to answer some of the questions that have been raised in the debate. I think that's really one of my duties, is to provide answers. There has certainly been no shortage of questions, and therefore I do not propose to write to every member whose questions I cannot answer, but if they do wish to persist with any of them, please do let me know, and I will make sure that you get answers in writing later on. I just want to make that absolutely clear. I think Rhoda Grant raised a number of questions which were then followed by other Labour members, to be fair, in quite a consistent fashion. So I think I'll just, if I may, address some of the questions that Rhoda Grant raised, and in doing so answer points that were made or echoed by a number of her colleagues. She raised the important point of demand reduction. Of course, we all want to see less energy used, and there's a great number of policy measures that are being put in place to do that across all parties. There's a general desire. This is not a political point, and whilst it's not for me to defend DEC, I know that DEC will bring forward the bill amendments to incentivise electricity demand reduction and to help address fuel poverty. And we will work with DEC to develop these matters in Scotland's interests and make sure that they go as far as they possibly can. Secondly, in relation to the effect on consumers, and many members have quite rightly raised these matters. I thought Dave Thompson, in his contribution, made quite a solid contribution analysing some of the bills and comparing them in the Highlands to other parts of Scotland, and indeed south of the border. I think that would merit a close reading and further consideration. But the EMR bill will provide powers to the UK Government to force energy companies to simplify tariffs if Ofgem's work to do so is not enough. I think we all agree, irrespective of our political standpoints, that that is a good power. And the question, of course, is how it should be exercised, or whether it should be exercised and in what circumstances. But to force energy companies to provide simple tariffs is a theme that has been made quite rightly by many members. And I think that's, I therefore welcome that provision in the bill. The bill will also introduce consumer redress orders where energy companies will be forced to pay compensation to consumers who are mistreated. Again, I think that's an extremely useful provision, I may say so, long overdue, because complaints by consumers have historically in Britain, I think, been seen more or less as a sort of futile exercise, because there was a sense that one's complaint was dealt with in a call centre somewhere, goes into the ether and nothing happens. So the prospect of consumer redress orders is something to which, in principle, I think we can all subscribe is a good idea. Malcolm Chisholm raised a number of specific points, and with regard to closure of the Scottish RO, I don't think other members specifically dwelt on this at length anyway. And we have always made it clear that matching the UK-wider timetable for closing down the RO to new generation will depend on a number of matters, including detail over CFD strike prices, a resolution for the issue I will come on to about a fair deal for our islands in relation to transmission charging, issues in relation to the backup. We will probably need another gas power station in Scotland as backup at some stage, issues in relation to various other technical matters. We're not there yet, but we have made it clear that we would only wish to proceed to move to the CFD after all these matters are dealt with. He also mentioned fixed rock mechanisms. Now, fixed rocks are a bit of a technical beast, but basically the rocks will be closed in 2037 for good. But as time goes on, there will be less of a market. The market becomes less liquid. There's more risk of price fluctuations, and the fixed rock system, details of which are still to be consulted upon, is designed to come into play in 2027 and will guarantee generators a fixed payment for all their rocks. Now, I want to turn to some of the more controversial, less technical points that were raised in the debate. And first of all, let me turn to the issue of renewables in independent Scotland. It's not the purpose of this debate to go into this topic in detail. That day will come. That day will come, and I can see there's a great deal of barely suppressed anticipation on the part of our opponents. That great day will come. But of course, the sensible thing is to maintain the cross-border electricity market. When electricity goes along a transmission line, it doesn't realise when it ceases to be Scottish and becomes English. And therefore, it makes sense that the grid system which has been developed, for practical reasons, will continue to operate on that basis. And energy is an area where Scotland makes a huge and necessary contribution to keeping the lights on south of the border. Now, several of the SNP members mentioned the recent contribution to the debate made by Alistair Buchanan of Ofgem. And I think we could all agree that whatever we may think about our party's views, Alistair Buchanan is in a position of some authority to opine on these matters. He is, after all, has been the head of the regulator in the UK. And his opinion was issued to the UK Government last October. And his opinion is that so serious, I'm afraid, has been the neglect of the electricity system in the UK that we're now reaching the situation where there's a real risk of the lights going out, at least south of the border, around 2015. Well, I'll certainly give way.
Very grateful for Mr Ewing for giving way. Given what he said about listening to people in authority, what is his response to the paper I quoted from the David Hume Institute, from Professor McGregor and his colleagues at Strathclyde, warning about issues around security of supply and rising costs to the consumer in Scotland in the event of independence?
Minister.
Well, I was going to come on to deal with these matters, and in particular, since Murdo Fraser quoted from the Bible earlier on in his opening speech, let me do likewise. Seek and ye shall find. And I suggest that if you seek the answer, you will find it in the DEC EMR Technical Annex A at paragraph 63, which I'm sure the member has read, but just is temporarily omitted to bring to his kind of frontal lobe. But you see, it points out the truth, presiding officer. The UK, in their EMR bill, has formulated plans to be able to purchase electricity from out with the UK. It plans to provide subsidies to other countries. It plans to cooperate with other countries, cooperate with countries like Ireland, cooperate with countries like Norway. It plans, and it's planning to give the powers to itself to grant CFDs, to grant the subsidies to all these other countries. Now, that's perfectly reasonable, because we are a party with an international outlook. Not only will England be our greatest friend, but we will have friendly relations with Norway, with Ireland, all these other countries. And we therefore welcome this approach being adopted by the UK Government. What a strange thing that approach is not matched in this Parliament, where the assumption is that the only country that will not receive the benefit of this friendly, international, cooperative approach will be Scotland. Scotland will be cut out from this approach, despite the fact, and here we get to some other inconvenient facts for our colleagues in the opposition benches. And the inconvenient facts are this, that the spare generation capacity is going to drop to 4% in England in 2015-16. Now, that means there's a huge risk that the lights will go out. Now, how is that going to be averted? Well, some members have said we'll import French nuclear energy. Well, unfortunately, the Germans and the Belgians have already more or less got that tied up, haven't they? And in any event, even if that were not the case, what is the maximum capacity that could be imported from that interconnector? 4%, not enough. And there's another point, and I've not heard this made, but it was made by Alistair Buchanan, and Mike Mackenzie quite rightly mentioned this, and that is this, that if it were the case that England, post-Scotland winning the referendum, becoming independent, decides that it's going to cease all kind of fraternal relations, cease all trade, stop the companies in England from participating in the renewable energy schemes in Scotland, which I can tell you will come as very bad news to some of the members of Renewables UK that I deal with. If that's all to be part of a sort of a new policy of non-cooperation, non-engagement, non-trade, then what will happen? What will happen is that England will be left with either power cuts on a regular basis or paying electricity at very, very high prices. Because, you see, the law of supply and demand comes in. If supply and demand are matched and if supply outstrips demand, the prices go up. So the Scottish Conservatives' policy would see English consumers paying through the roof for their energy bills. Were this
Minister needs to wind up now, please.
Ever to be pursued. So, in conclusion, I've perhaps dwelt over long on this area, but I did want to try and do it justice. I hope that I have. Let me return to the immediate and pressing priority. The biggest priority for me as Energy Minister is to get a fair deal for our islands. And we are close to decision time. And I'm delighted that we've had, with Ed Davey, a very good and positive and constructive relationship, so much so we put out a joint press release. Here we are, Ed Davey and myself, on the same page, as it were. And what we want to do jointly is persuade the Treasury that there must be a fair deal for the islands which does not disconnect their potential for renewable energy from the UK grid. And that will mean power from Scotland to avoid power cuts in England.
That concludes the debate on motion number S4M-06582 on electricity market reform. The next item of business is consideration of the Parliamentary Bureau motion on committee membership. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number S4M-06600.
Formally moved.
Question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion on substitution on committees. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number S4M-06599.
Moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number S4M-06582.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant, which seeks to amend motion number S4M-06582 in the name of Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6582.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant is as follows. Yes, 33. No, 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The second question is amendment number S4M-06582.2 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend motion number S4M-06582 in the name of Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The third question is that motion number S4M-06582 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended on electricity market reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The fourth question is that motion number S4M-06682 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on committee membership be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. And the final question is that motion number S4M-06599 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on substitution on committees be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. I now close this meeting of the Parliament.